Tato kami nui ki koutou kia ora. It is 2 minutes after the hour of 10 o'clock. Welcome to this meeting of the Dunedin City Council for the 27th of September 2022. And this being the first time this council has met since the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. I'd like to start the meeting today by standing and observing a minute's silence. Thank you. We have no presentations to the public forum. We have an apologies for lateness from Councillor Lofeso, Councillor O'Malley and Councillor Staines. I'll move that those be accepted. Seconded, Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. I'll move that we confirm the agenda without addition or alteration. Seconded, Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Any amendments to be made to the interests register? There appear to be none. I'll move that Council notes the elected members' interest register, confirms the proposed management plan and notes the executive leadership team's interest register. Seconded, Councillor Gary. Thank you. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Item 5, confirmation of the minutes. I'll move that Council confirm the public part of the minutes of the ordinary Council meeting held on the 30th of August 2022. Seconded, Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Reports. Item 6, actions from resolutions of Council meetings. I'll move that Council notes the open and completed actions from resolutions of Council meetings. Seconded, Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Item 7 is the forward work programme for Council September 2022. Councillor Walker.
Yep, thank you, Your Worship. Just a quick question, probably for CEO, on page 45 related to the Zero Carbon 2030 Alliance work and the MOU, and just where we are with the OS. I think it's Polytechnic, is it? Yeah.
So the Polytechnic have signed the MOU. We understand the university are working through their process, and staff are reviewing the wording that the ORC want changed.
Sorry, that's what
But at this point, it looks like it could be challenging, so we'll work through a process with that and bring that to the incoming council.
Councillor Barker. Nothing. Yeah, all good, thank you. I'll move that Council notes the updated Council forward work programme. Seconded, Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Item 8, which you will have received on the supplementary agenda, strategic refresh update. Ms. Graham, Ms. Weekaida. Good. Anything you wish to speak to this, or do you want to wait?
We can start. Gina is the corporate policy manager. She'll be on her way.
we're happy to take questions, Your Worship.
Thank you. And just for councillors' benefit, it's my intention to move the recommendations when we get to that point. But are there questions? Councillor Vandervis.
On page 7, it says under discussion, the key purpose of the strategic refresh work program is that should read, I suppose, is to embed the DCC's commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi and sustainability across DCC's strategies and operational activities. The key purpose of this refresh work program, how is that going to embed the DCC's commitment to the Treaty of Waitangi?
Councillor. So later in the report it talks about the Māori Strategic Framework, which is the intention of developing that is to enable Council to embed the Treaty of Waitangi across our operational activities.
So does this mean that the previously suggested review of the much older Maori Memorandum of Understanding is going to be part of that?
So just to clarify, the previous strategic refresh had as one of its key principles the Treaty of Waitangi together with sustainability. When the Harrison Grierson consultants and staff did a stock take on how we were operationalising that, we were not doing it to the best effect. So the MSF is part of our way to ensure that the Treaty of Waitangi, which is already a key direction and key principle in our existing strategic framework, is it will enable us to better deliver on that key principle. The MOU is a partnership arrangement with mana whenua, and it is another way in which Council can give effect to the Treaty of Waitangi.
So this is basically in addition to the MOU that goes back some number of years. My question really was, is there any intention to review the MOU, or does that stand?
Yes. No, the MOU is currently under review. That was a decision made last June by Council, and that work is underway.
I don't believe it was a decision made by Council, and I questioned at the time that it was slipped into another motion. Can you, after this meeting, please forward me the Council motion asking for it to be reviewed and the voting that went with that, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
Thank you. Where it says about three waters and in line with our strategies, how will that fit into the strategy given that we've sent a letter saying we're not happy with it and that we'd like a different model? On page 5 where it says the key strategies were developed by the DCC working with community and stakeholders over a period of approximately 8 years. The first strategy, the Three Waters Strategy Direction Statement, was adopted in 2010. The last, the parks. So just the whole refresh of all the strategies, where will that come into this, and how will that sit? That's what I'm wondering.
So, Councillor, the report references that one of the things that needs to be taken into account as part of the strategic refresh is the sector reform. So RM reform, Three Waters reform, and the Future for Local Government work. And so that's another driver for needing to review whether the strategic framework is still adequate for the vision and the direction that we want to take.
Given we don't know what's happening with those yet, is that difficult to plan for?
There is a degree of uncertainty, but we think that the refreshed draft framework that's on page 9 of your report is flexible enough to adapt whatever the nature of that sector reform ends up being.
Thank you. And with regards to Māori involvement, is that relating to all Māori or just mana whenua around our strategic refresh?
That is relating to all Māori.
Okay, thank you. And is there an intention to lead into co-governance with this, or is that not the case?
If I might, Your Worship, when you say co-governance, what do you mean and in what context?
Well, just with regards to what Councillor Vandevers was talking about earlier and the involvement of the Treaty of Waitangi and that incorporating, obviously we incorporated already, but given it's going to be included, more included, are we talking co-governance like 50-50, or is it just doing what we normally do and what we have to do under the treaty?
What we're doing is trying to move council more in the direction that is signalled it wants to go, which is to work more in partnership with Māori and with mana whenua in particular. And so that's what we are attempting to move towards with what we've proposed here.
Thank you.
Is it a fair assessment to suggest that this is about what it is that we are trying to achieve as opposed to being specific about how it is that we might achieve that?
That would be a fair assessment.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Worship. My question is just around the timing. In the Harrison Greer report that we got on May 21, it said that the strategy refresh would be from May 2022 to December 2022, and of course we've had COVID, etc., etc. So I know that this is being done towards the next 10-year plan, but I just wonder if we can get a sense of the timing about when the work streams might be complete and when we might see a final version.
Kia ora, Councillor Barker, just behind you, so sorry. Yes, the timeline has been adapted, but we are very focused on the June 2023, and you'll see in the next steps of all those programs before that time we'll be having workshops with councillors and our wider general public so that we can be confident in the material for approval for that 10-year plan. Thank you.
So my next question is just around the current strategies that we have, which seem to have been slightly neglected, and what will be the process about the reporting and making sure that those are delivered in the meantime if we've still got another year to go before we get these finished.
We've signalled before that we're going to work with the incoming council with a series of workshops on what we do with them, and you're right, some of them haven't been given the attention that they should have, but partly that's because they haven't been able to adapt to things that have changed. And so what's proposed here is a refreshed framework that is a bit more agile, that will enable us to take each of those strategies and work and look at what's still relevant, what we still want to focus on delivering, and what may no longer be timely. And so that work will happen with the incoming council between now and probably May for inclusion in the annual plan and then leading into that long-term plan.
So there's also a mention of action plans. So in the meantime, would action plans be generated through work programs like the housing action plan, etc., etc., so they would naturally kind of slide in under those?
Well, and look, and it's possible that with a focus on the well-beings, so the well-beings which cover off 4 of our key strategies, and well-beings are well mentioned in each of those strategies, but just not in an integrated way. So in recasting the well-beings and then weaving across action plans like the housing action plan or the destination management plan, we think we'll be able to capture what the good from the existing strategies and then the new that has happened since then that isn't captured by the strategies.
So one of the challenges in the old process was that there was there 40 strategies or something like that. So I'm just concerned about the number of action plans that might pop out. Is there going to be a process or thoughts about how many action plans might be achievable under that?
The changes we've been making internally to try and align the the business areas of council with the strategic direction, and so we've been developing work plans, forward work programs, and trying to align them all. And so I don't think there needs to be a set number of action plans that we can deliver. What this will enable is things like the places action plan, where we set targets for the year. We then can measure it against the well-beings and against whether we're hitting the aspirations in the city portrait, the Murray strategic framework. And if we have, it's job done, and then you replace it with something else potentially.
Councillor Gary.
Asked and answered.
Councillor Raddick.
Yes. Page 15, item number 65. I'm curious about the draft report is the Crow Global Report, which is referring specifically to the Dunedin City Council, and I'm just comparing that with the second quote from the Auditor General of New Zealand's statement. Is the Auditor General of New Zealand referring to councils throughout New Zealand or specifically to Dunedin?
The AG is referring to councils throughout New Zealand.
Yes, and fair enough. So, however, I'd wonder, could you characterise how the DCC has an over-reliance on satisfaction surveys, considering the state of our satisfaction surveys, and what are we doing about them?
I don't think we say in here that necessarily there's an over-reliance, but it's just timely with the levels of service to review that we've got the right measures that will mean that we are able to measure the right levels of performance and the right levels of satisfaction. And I think what the AG says is that you need a mixture of things, and I'm not sure that we've got the balance right. And the corporate policy team have done a huge amount of work in looking at what measures there are across all of the strategies and across in the LTP as well. And there's a workshop planned, I believe, as part of the schedule with councillors to assess where the balance sits.
And so, further to that, in the Auditor General's report, he suggests a range of measures or measurement tools or devices to actually gauge the service levels. Which of those are we using?
If I can respond, we actually are using a bit of everything, but I would say that what we're missing is strategic purpose around how we gather those and how we tell that story. And in the paper, we also mentioned that we are meeting with some of our lead data collectors. Statistics New Zealand, .Love's data are a couple, as well as Taituara. We're really trying to work with these data collectors so that we can pull out good quality, scientific, measurable data to tell the story of Dunedin more succinctly.
Right, hence we are having a review.
Hence the review. Kia ora.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Councillor Benson-Pope. Councillor Vanivers.
Getting back to the key purpose, it's also claimed that we're trying to embed sustainability across the DCC strategies. Does that include our DCC financial strategy?
The financial strategy is one of the key strategies, yes.
Given that sustainability essentially means being able to do things in a sustainable and ongoing way, and that our current financial data is adding $100 million to our debt annually in the most unsustainable fashion that I've seen in all my years on council, why is it that this strategic refresh doesn't address the extraordinary unsustainable increase in debt at a time when we also have massively increasing interest rates, with another 100 basis points increase anticipated before Christmas?
God, I'll get this right. The strategic refresh provides a framework. So So that's what this is a framework for how you then have those discussions and check that you are meeting the various strategic priorities of council.
So when data collection, as just previously mentioned, is wanting to be widened, is that not include the data collection that we already have very much available on debt and interest costs?
I'm sorry, I don't understand how that relates to the framework, because we have data, the finance strategy is represented in the framework. I'm not sure.
Well, that's actually my problem. I don't understand how sustainable financial strategy relates to this either, because plainly we don't have one, and the key purpose is supposed to be sustainability. I mean, you can't have black and white.
We do have financial strategy, Councillor. Council are delivering against that financial strategy, and it's represented in the framework.
So you don't agree that the financial strategy of increasing our debt by 100 million every year is unsustainable?
The financial strategy, Councillor, is a decision of council.
Excuse me.
Councillor.
I asked a question of the Chief Executive,
and
I would very much like an answer from the Chief Executive without your interruption, Your Worship.
The financial strategy is a decision of council that staff are giving effect to and is reviewed every 3 years as part of the 10-year plan process.
I'm completely aware of that. Can you
So that's
please
the
not
answer-
interrupt and allow the Chief Executive to answer my question?
The question's been answered, Councillor.
She never had a chance to open her mouth. You interrupted before she had the opportunity, Your Worship. Can I please have an answer to my question?
The rudeness of your comments aside, Councillor, the question has been answered. Councillor Walker.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. My question relates to paragraph 36, and obviously good there to that well-being is front and centre of this paper, and also good to see that the recognition that well-being is challenging. I'm just curious, when I read this paragraph, I couldn't quite understand the last part of it, where it talks about combining data sets across sets to better describe a specific community is becoming available. Can somebody just enlighten me how that actually looks in a tangible sense? Yeah.
Kia ora, Councillor Walker. Just to answer your question there, data sets can drill down to mesh blocks. There is some privacy concerns in that. They can go as far down as 20 households, but if you've got one refugee family, for example, in that 20 households, they become identifiable. .love's data has decided to not drill down to that specific level, but to keep it to twice that size. So it's just being aware that we are starting to get very nuanced data, and data sets that previously didn't talk to each other, such as across ministries in particular, are now starting to talk to each other. So the information is useful, but we have to be mindful through an ethical approach that we also are, that we hold our obligation to privacy, and that we don't fully rely on data. Data is one part of the picture, but we also have to qualify that by talking to residents.
Further questions? Councillor Elder.
Thank you. Just looking at 29, Figure 2, Refresh Draft Strategic Framework Visual, I really like this. And I was just a couple of questions. So we're looking at council, and then the second line is city portrait, which we've committed to, and Māori strategic framework. And so those two are overarching policies that feed into the rest of the framework, and how that fits into the rest of the framework.
That's right. They are shaping up to be sort of almost another smaller framework that we can then run the wellbeings through, and also each of the activities. So it just enables us to ensure that our key principles, the treaty and sustainability, have a way in which to operationalise themselves across work activities of council.
And my next question, just about engagement, and I know we've got some commentary around engagement and the future engagement with the community around these concepts and how they thread through our strategies.
One of the things one of the important aspects of Council's work is obviously engaging with our communities and ensuring that there was a really clear all-of-Council engagement approach that was front and centre of our strategy, hopefully enables us to give our communities some assurance that we have at the centre of our work our ability to engage successfully and openly and transparently with all of our community.
And I'll just add, I think part of what we've tried to do in the visual is lift engagement up to that same level with the city portrait, the strategic framework, and sit council there, so that actually is a really clear thing that council will be focusing on, because I think that it's easy to get lost, and so we hope that this visually means that it has the prominence that it deserves.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you.
Councillor Reddick.
Is that better? Yes, sorry. Just looking at two things. Firstly, the review of the Council's existing survey tools, the Residents' Opinion Survey. So the Electoral Commission is keen for the DCC to review the survey questions and widen the way we collect data. But, given that the Residents' Opinion Survey has suffered a plummet in several of the ratings, well, in particular for mayor and councillors, would it not be perceived that if we change the questions, then that is merely a method to obfuscate the data that's out there? Would it not be better would it be better to retain some survey questions for some time so that you have a consistency in data that can be compared year upon year for a while before this is changed?
Kia ora, Councillor Reddick. I absolutely agree. We're very, very mindful we need to keep some questions because we've had these sets for a number of years, and to lose that longevity in telling that story it's too important. So we wouldn't, as part of the workshop next year, this is what we'll be working through with councillors around teasing that out and making a case for why we think some questions may have done their time. We're also asking some questions a number of times over the years. If we think about the libraries, sometimes library users will be filling in some surveys, and we ask similar questions again in ROS. So we're just trying to be, I guess, more purposeful around the questions we're asking while not throwing everything out at the same time. Kia ora.
Right, I'll just comment on that. What appears to me is, does it also appear to you?
Is it a question, Councillor?
Yes. I just changed it to a question.
Right.
So it does appear to me, and does it appear to you that the consistent high ratings for the library in ROS is also apparent in more direct customer surveys from the libraries, that you are referring to?
To answer your question, it does seem that there is a trend of general satisfaction for the services, for sure, yes. And yes, and at times they're valuable assets for the cities that people
absolutely.
enjoy.
Well, it's good to have, completely different surveys producing the same result, which adds
Also good
weight.
to have questions, Councillor. Do you have any further?
I do have one more question. In terms of financial sustainability, it's a very important thing for the city. Do we have a measure or a formula or a tool or a protocol as to what we think, or what the DCC thinks is financially sustainable in terms of...
That is the financial strategy that was signed off by Council as part of the 10-year plan.
So we don't have an actual numerical formula-based answer.
For which particular question? So, for example,
financial
one of the measures in the financial strategy is our debt limit, for example, and that is set as 250% of revenue. So that is the measure that was agreed by Council when we adopted the financial strategy as part of the 10-year plan.
there's quite a few measures. So there's one, we talk about the balanced budget. We also talk about the balanced budget after removing things such as non-cash revenue. So those things are part of the financial strategy. And obviously that financial strategy will be up for review when we do the next 10-year plan.
And those measures are reported regularly through the financial papers that come to this meeting.
Thank you.
Further questions? Councillor Gary.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Just a small specific point, page 12, and it's paragraph 43, the draft city portrait. I was just curious as to the oddly specific one label on the perimeter of the circle. Most of the words are fairly high level, but it gets very specific to nitrogen and phosphorus, and I obviously understand the reason for those being there to some extent, but they are much more specific than the rest. Could you speak to that, or could... Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gary. We haven't done any changes to the outer rim because that is part of the donor economic model. However, this is part of the engagement workshops we'll be doing with communities. And if we look at what has happened with cities around the world, the naming of some of these categories have changed, so they're more meaningful for the local population while still retaining the ability to talk globally and compare globally.
Thank you.
Nothing further by way of questions. As I said at the beginning, I'm happy to move the recommendations seconded by Councillor Gary. And in speaking to this, I want to thank the staff for the significant amount of work that has gone into this. We spend a lot of time at Council applying our strategic objectives, and it's good to have the opportunity here to spend some time on the objectives themselves. It is, of course, our most important task at a governance level, and in terms of the governance work, it's certainly, in my view, the most significant achievement of Mayor Cull's administration, the strategic framework as it currently exists, and the rationalisation of that from dozens of strategies. Councillor, if we could have one person speaking at a time, that would be helpful. To the current wheel that we have, and this is the evolution of that, which finally will give due consideration to the Treaty of Waitangi and sustainability, which we've had as overarching objectives. But as has been reported to us many times, we hadn't really done the work to give effect to that. And this city portrait model is the opportunity for us to do that. It acknowledges the sustainable development goals as the social foundation of this work, and the ecological limits that we need to live within, and is conceptualising that within the four well-beings, which we have an obligation to give effect to under the Local Government Act, and more importantly and more excitingly, I think, doing all of that within a Te Ao Māori framework, and it is a significant body of work, as I said, to date, and there's plenty more to do mapped out between now and the adoption, the next council's adoption of the 10-year plan. And as you've seen in the papers for this is a piece of work that is not just nationally significant, but internationally significant, seeing the attention that it is garnering overseas, and we should all be rightly proud of that. The levels of service has been mentioned this morning, and I think we all shared a concern through the last 10-year plan process around the lack of rigour that was applied to the review of our levels of service. But I think in some ways that's been a blessing, because it's enabled us to do that next time around in a more strategic fashion, in that we are working at a strategic objective level, which will then inform the levels of service, which will then inform our performance measures, and then on to budgets, resourcing, and monitoring of those. That is an entirely sensible approach to how we go about measuring the performance of council against the strategic objectives. We've agreed that all of these things need to be reviewed and updated, and we've committed to doing that through that work. And I think it is notable the comments that have been made by the Auditor General around the limits of satisfaction surveys. Nobody is arguing that they are not helpful, but I think over-reliance on them, as has been pointed out, isn't necessarily going to get us the best and broadest understanding of how we're going against what it is that we are trying to achieve. So certainly useful, certainly not worth throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but I think a broader range of measures and metrics will be far more useful at a governance level, and certainly far more useful for our community to be able to talk to them about the work that we are doing. And so, but in the meantime, we have what we have in the meantime. But I think, given the review work, the substantial review work that's going on, it's worth sounding a note of caution about an over-reliance on a status quo that we have all agreed is insufficient in achieving its purpose. So, thanks again to the staff. It's no small task. And there's plenty of work to be done with the incoming council and with our community as we head through the next 18 months to 2 years. Further speakers, Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Your Worship. Although Flex is not my friend at the moment, I was really excited to see the weaving and the strategic framework. I thought it really brought everything together. I supported the strategic refresh, and I think, we were bang on about the strategies and how many of them were sitting dusty on the shelf. So I was really excited to see all of the pieces of the strategies weaved in, along with the levels of service, the city portrait, the Māori strategic framework and engagement. I think this is a really beautiful piece of work, and I really like that the action plans are also going to weave through, so we're actually getting things delivered. I also took on board what talking about the smart measurements for levels of service, because then people can actually see what they get for their rates. The ROS surveys, we're seeing them go down in the last couple of years, and whether it's COVID or whether it's that we changed the measurement, that's quite difficult. The levels of service, I think we had over 100 measures in our annual plan and just achieved 45% of them, because, as was pointed out in the appendix, some of them are a bit odd. We're asking people that don't have dogs how they feel about the dog service. It's not great. So in the end, I'd really like to thank the staff. This is a really complex and difficult piece of work to bring together all of these pieces, and I'll be really excited to see it come towards for the next 10-year plan. Thank you.
Councillor Elder.
I too would like to congratulate staff on the work they've done on this, and I particularly like the Whakatū refresh draft strategic framework visual, because in fact it's very difficult to get a visual that enables us to thread through all our Māori strategic framework, our city portrait, and integrate them into our levels of service, integrate them into our strategic refresh. And this is a really simple way of actually reflecting that throughout all our strategies. And I think the weaving, it creates a basket, and a basket creates a place where people can get food from and be sustained, and that's a really, really good thing. I also endorse an update in the engagement development, because I think a refresh and a look at what we're doing, it is quite a big change, I suppose. It's so we need to actually engage our community really, really well, and tell the story and the narratives of what this means, so that people can actually engage with it and understand it and know about the implications of it, etc., across the framework. So, yeah, I've always liked the weaving analogy, because in fact things are actually quite complex and threaded through each other, and it's very hard to actually take them out piece by piece. So it's a great integrated model. Thank you.
Councillor Reddick.
Yes, I support this strategic refresh, and I really admire the answers that I've received to my questions. And thank you. And the work that is being done on this, as a reader of Kate Raworth, I am a believer in the donut economics, and I like having this these circular diagrams to describe well-being and how it pertains to the city. The critical aspect that is missing from our city at the moment is taking the population with us, because the Residents' Opinion Survey, whilst it has been decried here, does give an indication of the feeling of the population. And if there's one thing they consistently say, is that they feel they are not being listened to. So it is critically important that we have this strategic refresh and we engage genuinely, as Councillor Elder has pointed out, with the population so they are attracted to a better future rather than being attempted to forced into something they don't want. Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
Thank you. Something that's very clear here that I hope will be a big improvement is that communication channels between different departments will improve, and there'll be it'll be an overall strategy incorporating bringing in different areas in council, and I think that makes sense because so often one size does not fit all, and it's, you know, like I've talked about with the building department often, that you need to, you know, you've got to do your plumbing, you've got to do your infrastructure, all those different things, that when there's a lot of things that happen you know, all at the same time, and it's really good if we have departments talking to each other. I think a good example of that was actually used by one of the staff before, talking about how dealing with the government and how it was easier when they were starting to have better communication from the different departments, and that's the same at local government. So hopefully this will help that. Thank you.
Councillor Gary.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. And I just want to acknowledge this is a huge body of work and appreciate that we've had an update at this point in the triennium. I want to acknowledge too and pick up on something that His Worship said, which was about this being an evolution. And it certainly is progressing on from what we had. It doesn't mean that what we had was bad. It's just that we're in a different time. And it needs updating, it needs refreshing. So that's the journey we're on. But certainly a large amount of work went on previously to reduce the number of strategies down to a manageable number. And I recall the work that went into that and the process that we went through. So we wouldn't be in this place now if that hadn't taken place. I want to acknowledge the importance of the timing of this, and there is a lot of work yet to do. We do have action plans and policies that will fall out of this, and there's some urgency to that. So that's the difficulty and the contradiction that we have. It's wonderful to see the 4 wellbeings, which we're required to do, but we have embraced this very much, and so it's people-centred, which is so important in these times. I too am extremely proud of the leadership that this council has shown in getting to this point and setting our city up for the future as we progress through this work. So thank you to staff for taking that up and continuing that journey for us. Thank you.
Further speakers? No. Well, in my right of reply, briefly, I just want to thank Councillor Raddick for his enthusiasm for the work that we are doing, and I won't say anything more lest I disavow him of that notion any further. And I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Those against? That's agreed. Thank you. Item 9, a naming of private ways. Mr. Drew and Mr. Spears. Welcome. Anything by way of introduction from either of you?
No, just happy to take as read and answer any questions.
Thank you. One from me at a higher level, given that this is consistent with the policy itself. What is it that requires it to come to Council for approval?
The Local Government Act requires it to be resolved.
Fine, thank you. Questions? Councillor Barker.
I have a question about the name list. I submitted a whole bunch of women's names back in, I think it was April, and I just wondered what the process and timeline was for, do those names need to come to council to be approved, or would they just go on the list?
Councillor, they will we'll consult with the families of the people involved over the next few months, and then they'll come back to council for, if they meet the policy, they'll come back to council for approval.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I note that often when we have these papers that the developers choose the male-orientated names, there are some women's names on the list, and I know that's being added to. Has any thought been given to some sort of mechanism to encourage them to consider some of the female names? It seems to be the go-to, and that's a difficult thing to answer, I know, but I just wonder if there's any mechanism.
The report in front of us is to accept or not the suggested name. And there are other questions to be raised around the policy itself or how that works, but I feel like that's a separate conversation to
Understand,
one
Your
where
Honour.
being asked to apply where we are currently.
Thank you, Your Honour. Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Benson Pope is moving the recommendations. Seconded Councillor Hall. Should I just speak to it?
Briefly, one of the incidental pleasures of reading about these suggestions is finding out more about the city's history, and in this case, an extraordinary story about Mr. McEwen, who was a long-term servant of the city, and I think it would be helpful in the other conversation that you're alluding to that we need to have if those cameos were also included so that the wider community as well as elected members can find out the background to some of these names from some of these important identities. And I didn't even mention the MP for Dunedin South.
The speakers?
Previous.
There it
in the report.
Indeed previous.
Very previous.
Being none, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against, that's agreed. Item 10, submission on the inquiry into the future of interregional passenger rail in New Zealand. Mr. Drew, welcome back, and Ms. Benson. Anything from either of you? No. Questions? There appear to be none. Someone, Councillor Elder.
I have a question. I know that we're actually submitting to the review, but I was wondering whether within that review there's the opportunity for us to have an experimental approach regarding, say, if there's an all-black test here and getting a train down from Christchurch, for example, for that weekend.
So I think, Councillor, we have suggested that events, using trains for events is probably something that should be looked at.
Thank you.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. I was just wondering, Janine or Simon, whoever, item 14, it says the DCC acknowledges the need for a stronger evidence-based and requests the development of a business case for the re-establishment of passenger rail between Mosgiel and Dunedin and the wider region. And they're also asking for a trial, but I'm assuming that that would be something when you're asking for a stronger business case that you would also be noting the efficiency and the economics of it, whether or not it was viable for a provider to provide that service.
Yes, most definitely the business case would have to look into the viability from an economic and financial perspective.
I know you've had a past history in rail, but do you know if in cities like Wellington where they use the units and go in and out to the cities, do you know if in those areas they are actually standalone economically, or are they heavily subsidised by council? Or?
No, they're still subsidised, Councillor.
Yeah, thank you.
From memory, the fare rate for public transport in the Wellington region in particular is significant from a government funding point of view. Councillor Benson Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. We know from our previous discussions about attempts to get some sort of passenger rail running to the south, that one of the major constraints is the freight use, timing of freight use from the south, or Kiwi Rail. And I'm also aware in other contexts of the similar issues relating to disturbance at the Frontiera site by the timing of trains from the south because of those reasons. Is it true that the question of the passing lane is the key to all of that? Track maintenance levels aside, is that what would unlock the potential for better routing and better timing and passenger rail to Mosgiel?
Yes, there certainly would not be the capacity on the existing infrastructure during the dairy peak to support passenger services. You would need to have a passing loop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Ms Benson, or even for Mayor Hawkins, I thought there may have been some narrative around Dunedin being a student city, and the movement of students would be very much inclined to want to use rail, especially in the South Island. And I thought there might have been something in relation, or some narrative in this paper around that.
As the councillor knows, the drafts are written by staff, so I'm not going to respond to questions around the drafting. Ms Benson, do you have anything to offer?
Or we can certainly consider that.
And the other part that I thought could be sort of strengthened was the wording around the importance of an inland port. You know, we've already discussed the impact of Frontiera and the dairy movements and things like that, but really the inland port is a big part of this whole narrative as well.
Yes, so Councillor, we were specifically responding to the request around interregional rail, passenger rail, so that's why we've kept it very passenger centric.
Councillor Lofiso.
Tēnā koe, Your Worship, tēnā kōrua. My question sort of follows up on Councillor Lord's, in that the summary of considerations on page 62 notes that you haven't had time, and of course everyone's crazy busy to talk to mana whenua about their takiwā. But I'm just assuming, checking that if there is a business case that will, consultation with mana whenua will
Most
go
definitely.
ahead. Thank you.
Councillor Vanavis.
On page 56, down at the bottom, it talks about the DCC supporting continued investigation to the feasibility of an inland port at Melbourne. How many years, in your understanding, have we already been investigating this continued investigation?
Councillor, I'm not too sure, but I know that we haven't had any money to do a proper business case investigation into an inland port in south of Dunedin.
But you are aware that this has been floated for probably a decade now?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
You'll be aware that this has been floated for a decade now, the idea of the inland port?
Okay.
Are you aware of the success of the Napier inland ports, where they've actually set up 3 of them? And as a result, Napier, which has a much less good natural harbour than us, is now the second largest volume port in the country.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Will that be looked into, or do we need to pass a resolution to give us some budget to do that?
This is a submission in response to questions government are asking around inter-regional passenger rail. There are plenty of opportunities through the next annual plan process for council to choose to resource whichever work it may want to do in terms of the wider rail network.
Right, I understand. The reason I think this is relevant is that if we are going to get serious about an inland port, then the capacity for passenger rail is going to be much more severely constrained by freight. But on to my next question. It says in 12 on page 65, item 12, It says that the DCC notes that it may be difficult to currently justify a regular scheduled service due to the slow travel times. My understanding is that the slow travel times are largely because we have a twisty, turny, especially over the hills going over to Waitati railway line, that cannot possibly be ameliorated with any amount of money. Is it possible that we can do anything about that slow time given the turns and twists of the rail line? I understand you have lots of previous experience with it.
Yes, so it's a very slow trip up the hill from Dunedin. It is a relatively flat section of track between Oamaru and Christchurch, but the constraint in New Zealand is the gauge.
Right, so because we've got narrow gauge, you can't go around corners fast. And also, in our particular case for passenger rail, especially between here and Oamaru, is it true that we really can't do much about the very slow travel time for passenger rail?
Well, not without a lot of major investment, Councillor Van Vis.
Thank you.
Councillor
Reddick. Just coming back to items 17 to 21, which is the double track between here and Mosgiel. So I would like to know, is it possible to strengthen our submission a little?
Yes.
In terms of the usability. I mean, you have made mention of most of the points, but there is, in terms of the emissions reduction.
Councillor, the submission can say whatever council wants the submission to say. If you're looking to amend it to say something different, I would recommend you spend the time drafting what that might look like for council to consider. But for probably the last time this term, the submissions, the content of submissions are in the hands of council. So you could ask the question and staff will say, yes, you could change it to say that. But yes. I've saved you the time.
Righto, I'll look at that. Thank you.
Councillor Houlihan.
Thank you. It says in here, and we all are aware of it, that the South Island has had low, underinvestment in rail for so long. Why do you think the government just ignored? I suppose it's a hard question, but do you think,
Question for staff, Councillor.
No. All right. Thank you.
Further questions? He asks advisedly. There are none. Would someone like to move the submission per the recommendations? It's been moved by Councillor Benson-Pope. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Houlihan. Councillor Benson-Pope.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think we'd all agree, I'm sure, that more attention and more expenditure on this part of our New Zealand's wider transportation network is long overdue. I think the fact that this submission has been invited around passenger rail is more than welcome, and I hope that government will in fact listen to the submissions it receives from various authorities and help facilitate not only the sort of improvements that we're suggesting around that would be of immediate local advantage to us every time we've tried to come up with a support for initiatives to the south. We've run into the same problem in terms of timing of freight on a single track, but also the obvious logic and desirability of more passenger use of the main line, not just for freight, separate issue, but for passenger rail to the north on a very scenic trip, actually.
Councillor Van Vis.
I hate to disappoint Councillor Benson-Pope, claiming that we all agree that more expenditure on passenger rail is long overdue. Passenger rail in the South Island has been virtually non-existent apart from heritage-type tours for many years now, and the very obvious reason it's been non-existent is because there simply isn't the population or the economies of scale to make passenger rail work. If you look at passenger rail in most Western countries, actually, you'll find that it's been declining pretty rapidly from the 1950s onwards. Car use continues to go up and become more efficient and much quicker. We've had confirmation today that we cannot increase without massive investment the slow speed of passenger rail between here and Oamaru at least, meaning that passenger rail A can never be economically viable, B will always be a much slower option, and in my view, we are going to have even more issues trying to promote passenger rail because it's going to get in the way of freight scheduling and timetables. And I agree that we should have a lot more of our freight moving on rail because that really does work well. We do have the economies of scale for that. So I don't agree that we should be spending money looking at passenger rail. It's simply not viable and is not going to be. The passenger rail that we could and should look at would be, I believe, tourism focused between along the main trunk line only. We simply cannot afford to do the Middlemarch line. And that we should do day trips on a non-scheduled basis to Waitari, to Oamaru, to wherever on the main trunk line with a reduced number of our Tairi Gorge railways rolling stock. This particular hope that we can somehow rejuvenate passenger rail in the South Island, despite all the financial evidence showing that that's simply not viable, I think is quite frankly a waste of time and money. I won't be voting for it.
Councillor Houlihan.
Yes, I will be voting for it, and I disagree with most of what Councillor Vandervis just said. The people in Mosgiel have said to me numerous times that they're very in support of a rail service, passenger rail service from Mosgiel to Dunedin, because it used to happen, and we can do it again, and I think it's a fantastic solution for getting cars off the road and getting people trying to use public transport. There's a real nostalgia with trains and people love it. I mean, we could have some Wi-Fi in there. They could sit there doing their work on the train. You can get a coffee and something to eat. It's actually, there's something quite special about trains. And so I fully support this, and it makes sense for us to submit to this because the government's looking at it and make our case as strongly heard as possible. I personally have been, popping on the Transport Minister's Facebook page as often as possible saying, bring passenger rail to Mosgiel. But anyway, we will try our best. Thank you.
Councillor Barker.
Thank you, Isha. I support this. We know that there's 30,000 car movements a day between Mosgiel and the city, so any way that we could actually get cars off the road and lower emissions is a good thing. Well, there would be absolutely no point if we didn't submit on this. It's a great opportunity for us to state our case. I'd also like to see the government invest money in the Middlemarch line. Maybe one day Middlemarch might be a thriving little city, I guess, a city adjunct, and it would be great to actually keep the line going in case we do grow like we expect to grow. So I support everything that's in the submission, and I'm really pleased to see it go forward and hope that government sees fit to invest more in Dunedin's rail system.
Councillor Reddick.
Yes, I support this, and I think a critical aspect of the rail system for the South Island will be that double tracking at Mosgiel, and perhaps it could be suggested to the government that as a experiment to start with, they double track that line, and then we can start with commuter trains between Mosgiel and even Port Chalmers. But the key thing being the double tracking of the line is a severe impediment to effective running of a train to Mosgiel. But also it's an effective impediment, it is a significant impediment to the running of the Tairi Gorge train. So having that line double tracked would make a significant difference to the viability of the whole passenger network through the South Island, but it could be done, the process could be started with that double track. And so if the government paid for that, we could then run train trips, passenger rail from Mosgiel to Dunedin relatively easily, and so conduct the experiment for the government. So that would be a significant incentive for them to do that. Anyway, it would be good to see trains more in use, and very much in keeping with us as a heritage city, having our beautiful railway station in regular use would be a very attractive thing for the city and attract more tourists to come and visit and use the trains.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to take this opportunity to acknowledge colleagues who have put forward ideas over the triennium around rail. These ideas have been percolating away over those 3 years, and this submission gives us a chance to put those forward in a realistic way, and covers everything from the inland port to commuter rail to specific issues that we have here. And it also adds to the call for government to invest in this city in this way, an area that we feel has been underinvested in. I was glad to hear my colleague mention the railway station, which is iconic, not just here but in the Southern Hemisphere. And I can recall coming in on a train to that railway station many years ago. It feels like now. How amazing would that be? I want to acknowledge how lucky we are to have the skills and background of Ms Benson with her background in Kiwi Rail that adds to the depth of this information, and in anticipation of Your Worship speaking to this, or whoever is going to speak to this. I notice that's in the letter, in the submission, because I think that adds to it to be there in person. Thank you for the work that has been put into this.
Further speakers? Well, I can support this. We know that we need to provide options for people to move around the country differently, and rail has to be a significant part of that. And while this is a submission that is focused on inter-regional rail, there have been comments made today around a commuter service, whether that's coming in from the south, from Mosgiel, or coming in from Port Chalmers, and I think it is relevant because the kinds of infrastructure upgrades that would be needed to facilitate an inter-regional service would also be beneficial to running a commuter service, or vice versa. So I don't think we can separate those. Similarly, around the capacity of the freight network, which we know we need to move more goods around by rail, the infrastructure upgrades that would be required for that would be beneficial for a passenger rail service. And I think, we do have the opportunity to some degree, supply of drivers willing in looking at an express bus service from Mosgiel into town as a way of testing the appetite for people to travel differently on that commuter route. I think that will be relevant information. I have very fond memories of my trips on the Southerner between Invercargill and Dunedin, or between Invercargill and Christchurch. But nostalgia is a hell of a drug, and I think what we need to do is figure out what it would look like financially to run a service like this, because I know plenty of people would appreciate the opportunity to be able to travel between cities without having to fly, or without the stress of having to drive, and certainly in Dunedin's case, the luxury of arriving in the middle of the city as opposed to the more pastoral terrain of Mamona, where your flights get in. I think fundamentally Kiwi Rail have been asked the wrong question for a very long time, and they've been tasked with essentially making money. And that has led to a service that has diminished in its scope and is focused increasingly on expensive tourism products that are of limited value to people who live in our community and want to get around the country differently. And it's a philosophical argument about what economically viable might mean. I don't know how economically viable libraries are, or swimming pools are, or parks and gardens are, but we invest in them because there is a public good in investing in them, and our transport network shouldn't be considered any differently. And I think until government changes the questions it asks of KiwiRail, then we're going to keep getting the same answer, and that's something that that needs to change. I mean, I welcome the enthusiasm of government for investment in rail. It's a shame that it stops as far south as it does, but this is our opportunity to remind them of how important this is to our city and to our community, and would love for there to be an opportunity again to be able to travel around Te Waipounamu by train sometime in the not too distant future. Councillor Benson Pope, your right of reply.
Thank you, Worship. The only other matter I'd address is the issue of constraints around the existing infrastructure choices. We all know that we are hampered by the narrow gauge, which is not something that's going to be fixed in the short term, let alone ever. We also know the issues around tunnel width and tunnel height that caused a lot of problems for KiwiRail in respect of containerisation on flatbed trucks. But this is happening, this submission is happening in the context of other work in our city at Hillside, and so the focus has changed, and I think the submission covers the priorities for this community. Thank you.
Put the motion. All those in favour? We'll take it by division.
Councillor Barker.
Aye.
Councillor Benson Pope.
Aye.
Councillor Elder. Yes. Councillor Gary.
Aye.
Councillor Hall. Aye. Councillor Houlihan.
Aye.
Councillor Lefiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor Raddick.
Aye.
Councillor Vandervis.
No.
Councillor Walker.
Aye.
Councillor Wiley.
Yes.
Your Worship.
Aye.
Carried 12-1.
Thank you. Item 11, the Dunedin Heritage Fund Activity Report 21/22. Mr. Drew and Mr. Maudsley, welcome. Any opening remarks?
No, just
Either
this
of you?
update report. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I have one very particular one, and just because I'm familiar with the residents, in the way that these are categorised, a number of them are residential dwellings, that is fine. Threave is the example I'm thinking of, which is still a residential dwelling. It's just not categorised as such, and so I wonder, just in future, whether that might be helpful for people to know. Threave is an grand old house on High Street that's listed as a recipient of grants funding. It's just not clear that it's a residential dwelling, that's all. And I hadn't checked all of them. It's just one I recognised. Are there questions? Councillor Gary.
Thank you. I notice on paragraph 8 on page 63, it talks about the extensions that have been needed, which is understandable. Has that situation eased at all in terms of folk getting tradespeople to do the work?
No, we're still receiving a number of extensions, and it's cited that the availability of materials and the availability of trades is still a challenge for applicants.
Thank you.
Moved by Councillor Barker, seconded by Councillor Lord. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor?
Thank you, Worship. As Chair of the Heritage Fund, I'd like to thank the staff, especially Mr Maudsley. The work has got more and more over the years. This year there was obviously 40 applications. Back in 2018 there were 15, so there's an awful lot of work that goes into this. We've got a very proud status as the Heritage Capital of New Zealand, and we have the most listed heritage buildings in New Zealand. Over 50% of our visitors come for the heritage, and that's the previous to COVID, $700 million industry, so it is really important. I do want to see the 2007 Heritage Strategy revised into a Heritage Action Plan, so that refers back to the strategic work that we've done, so we can address some important issues. And you can see there's been delays in some of the work, and this is related to access to skilled craftspeople, the ability to get things like slate, etc., to do the buildings, and then also a lack of tourism, which has helped fund some of those heritage projects. So some of the heritage projects aren't actually happening at the moment, even though there's obviously 40, which is a lot. We've supported some really important buildings in the Dunedin landscape, and when you look through you can recognise a lot of community churches, and there's also a great spread. So we've done some in Outram, Makawaiti Heritage Centre, the Platypus Museum in Middlemarch as well, which is going to be exciting. So the Heritage Fund also sparks a lot of economic development and well-being in those places. I urge everybody to get out and look at the heritage buildings that we've put the funding into. A lot of them have the signs outside, so that's great to see. The Heritage Plan would also be able to help address those other important issues, like the people who are demolition by neglects, protecting some of those buildings, which obviously end up in the media and also provide a terrible eyesore to us. So there's been some great work done on the Heritage Fund, great promotion, as we can see that there's more applications coming in and a whole lot more work being done. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Benson-Poke.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to follow on from the previous speaker and in complimenting the work of staff and the excellent collaboration from Heritage New Zealand and their representatives to achieve what this fund does. I'm reluctant to suggest that the level of funding is about appropriate at the moment. That may be a discussion for a future annual plan. The Chief Executive, I notice, is smiling. But I think it's also appropriate to acknowledge that the fund and the committee that makes these decisions has made a very good job of balancing the conflicting public and private motivations and interests that are involved with a lot of these applications. It is difficult, not a problem for public buildings. Excuse me, more problematic at the other end of the spectrum for houses or other buildings that are entirely in private occupation. But I think those decisions have been carefully balanced. And I must say, on those occasions when there have been large outliers, such as has been the case historically with the Priory and the First Church steeple, that the city has shown its creds by augmenting the funds to cope with very large applications which needed to be supported when the fund had no capacity to do that from its normal day-to-day cash flow. So I think it's a very good testimony to the support that this council has over the years shown for one of the key elements of our built heritage and environment.
Councillor Lord.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. Yeah, no, look, I just want to say that it was an area that when I first joined the council in 2013, I probably didn't think too much about the historic buildings, but when I see what's been done, I look at this list and I just think of the Outram Hotel, how it looks now compared with how it looked 4 months ago. It's just a chalk and cheese difference, and you know, I sit there and I drive around our city now and I see the buildings, and I know the ones over the last 7 or 8 years that we've given money, and I think of some of the work Mr Hazelton did by, or Dr Hazelton, by, you know, often relatively small sums, $20,000 or $30,000 over 2 or 3 years, and some rate relief, and it's seen an old building that was really not fit for much being converted to cafes or apartments or a new office space. And I just see some of those old buildings around the city, how they've been used. The use of this fund has triggered much greater spends, and which result in much greater values, and in turn in the future greater rates. But that's not the purpose why we do it, and I just absolutely support this work ongoing.
Thank you, Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Your Worship. Several months ago, I attended the AGM of Le Clé door the concierges, top concierges from throughout the country. And the abiding comment that was made was the heritage. The point of difference for this city is our heritage buildings, and that was commented to me multiple times. It's also something in my deputy mayor role and people I meet on behalf of the city that say, and this is diplomats, people who are visiting the city for the first time, they comment on what we have done with our heritage buildings in terms of restoration. So this is a really far-reaching investment, and Councillor Lord put it very well around the small amount really of money that provides extraordinary results. Just picking up on what Councillor Benson Pope said, there's a conversation to have in the future about the level of investment, and I think we now understand what we can achieve through that. The other thing to be mindful of is the credibility it gives the project when council approves the grant. It provides credibility for sometimes other funds to be gathered. And there's a great balance of private and also community facilities. I think of the likes of the Pukahiki Church, which is particularly old and significant, and there's other community facilities on that list. And my final point is around the tradespeople who do this work. We've got extraordinary talent in the city for this work. Quite bespoke in many cases, from stained glass to cabinet makers to stonemasons with extraordinary skills that are internationally of an international standard, and this work means they have a pipeline of work to do. So it's providing work for those people. So thank you to staff and to the committee for the grants and the work that they have done.
Thank you. Councillor Hulan.
Thank you. I agree with all the comments made previously, because our heritage buildings are exceptional. And for some people, though, the cost of earthquake strengthening those properties is beyond them. And so if we can get some funds going to them through this, I think is excellent. And I would actually support putting more money into this, because, you know, our buildings are worth saving. They're stunning. Some of them are absolutely gorgeous. Thank you.
Councillor Barker, your right of reply.
Thank you. We should just quickly, two things. I should have done a shout out and thank you to Heritage New Zealand and the Southern Heritage Trust. So thank you, Councillor Benson Pope, for reminding me of that. They come to all our meetings, and their expertise and insights are much appreciated when we're going through some sometimes difficult decisions. And I was really pleased to hear some councillors say that perhaps the Heritage Fund should have more funding. When we look at it, we've had given around $765,000 in heritage grants, which help facilitate approximately $8.5 million in construction. So it's actually really benefiting the city. So I commend the work that's been done.
You will put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Item 11, Animal Services Annual Report to the Department of Internal Affairs. Ms Austin and Ms McGill. 12. There's a disconnection between. Won't be the last time, I promise. Welcome, the two of you. Anything by way of opening, or we're taking the paper as read?
Take it as read, Your Worship.
Thank you. Questions? Been moved by Councillor Wiley. Seconded by Councillor Hall. We do have questions though from Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think I've asked this question on a number of occasions. It relates to point 8, when we talk about the majority of dog owners comply with respective leash-only area requirements. And I think I've pointed out a number of times that isn't the case on the West Harbour walkway. And the question, I guess, is there any intention or possibility of increasing the sign size? Because that's the feedback I get from people when I approach them. They say they just simply didn't see signs.
You could use your, sorry, if you could use your microphone, that'd be helpful.
Apologies, sorry. Thank you, Councillor. The marketing team are actually reviewing signage at the moment, so we are looking at tendering that, and we will be looking at new signs.
I'd like to speak to it, Councillor.
Thank you, I will. As a dog owner of 2 dogs, I think the key that I consistently look at is, one, the quality of work that our staff do in this space and the challenges that they deal with. And to note, I think we should highlight how many good dog owners we have in the city consistently. I think that's the important part. There are so many passionate dog owners, and I think they are actually great advocates, and they actually do a lot of self-policing and essentially, to be honest, harass some of the poor dog owners in their behaviours. But I think this report very much summarises what's been going on in the city, and also noting, obviously through COVID, and the increase of dog ownership and the role that dogs have played in supporting their owners. But I think the part is, when we start looking at some of the behaviours, you know, if all the education in the world sometimes will not help bad dog owners. And I think that's a disappointing factor, is that let's celebrate the good owners and the dogs that are essentially being well looked after in this space, and also thank the staff for the work they've been doing in this area.
A right of reply required. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? That is agreed. Item 13, I guess, is the 2022 annual report to ALA. Mr. Meechin and Ms. Weekhired are welcome.
Just straight to questions, thank you, Mayor.
Councillor Benson-Pope is happy to move that. Are there questions in advance of that? Councillor Barker.
I have a question on page 88, and it's around the review of the local alcohol policy, and I just wonder, it says a review is underway to consider whether there is a case for a formal review, and I wonder, is that an internal review or is that something that council does itself?
When the policy was first mooted and put to the council, it was decided to review it after 2 years to see if there was any fine-tuning that needs done. I've started that review, but now we've got the bill before Parliament. Well, it's not before Parliament yet, but it's been introduced to Parliament. We'll just sit and wait and see the result of that before we go further.
Councillor Elder.
Thank you. On page 82, there has been a small increase in off licences, and that relates to remote sellers. And I was just wondering, is there any auditing or accountability related to remote sellers? Because someone could order and they could be under 18, for example. Is there any kind of, accountability these off licence and remote sellers have to fit?
Sorry about cutting over you. That's something the police look at. I would have to ask the police how often they check that. When they're first licensed, they get a 12-month review, and I'm not entirely sure how that's reviewed as far as making sure the person receiving the alcohol is 18 or older. I know that the delivery people sign a contract that they will check the dates of birth of people who look under 25, but whether or not that takes place, I've no idea.
Thank you.
No questions. Councillor Benson-Pope is moving the recommendations. Is there a seconder? Seconded Councillor Walker, thank you. Any speakers? Yes?
Yes, just briefly, Your Worship. We're all aware of the submission we made recently about the bill that Mr. Meechin referred to, so I think this is pretty much a work in progress. Thank you to the people who do the daily work, staff and other appointees to the panel. I think they do a very responsible and thorough job, and whether we will have the opportunity to be a little more robust as this plan is reviewed in due course remains to be seen, pending the outcome of legislation yet to make its way through the House.
Councillor Wiley.
I also want to thank the staff in this space, but also, more importantly, the committee that meet and hear these and go through this process. I think the strength of that committee has actually just got stronger and stronger, and I think that has been a success of this term. Thank you.
You'll make them blush. Further speakers? Your right of reply. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? That is agreed. Item 14, the financial result period ended 31 August. Mr. Logie. Anything you wish to add?
Just happy to take questions, Your Worship.
Questions, Councillor Vincent-Pope.
Thank you, Worship. I'd just like to refer to page 93, Mr. Logie, and namely of the four graphics, the borrowing metrics graphic. Are you confident, obviously the fact that we're within our agreed parameters in terms of funding and servicing interest is good news. Are you confident that those levels are appropriate for an organisation of this size and of this economic heft?
Just so we're clear, the 250% debt over annualised revenue is set as part of the financial strategy. Yep. It is in line with the LGFA levels. In fact, the LGFA levels are higher. In terms of the other two metrics, they are as specified by the LGFA, so again, they would seem to be industry standards. And obviously we're running below those numbers.
And they're consistent with, when you refer to them as industry standards, they're consistent with the performance and the same similar parameters of other local authorities throughout the country? Thank you.
Councillor Vanavas.
On the same issue, are you aware that in terms of debt, the DCC is currently running a close third behind Auckland and one other, and that in terms of ability to pay debt, that Dunedin people have the lowest per capita disposable income of any city in New Zealand?
Again, the level of debt and the metrics in relation to the debt is set by council.
Yes, but my question was, are you aware that Dunedin people have the lowest disposable income of any city in the country, and therefore will have a lot more difficulty in paying for the anticipated extra interest costs that this debt brings about?
Not sure that's a question for the CFO to answer, Councillor. It's a question for Council to answer in setting its financial strategy.
I would have thought the CFO's awareness of ability to pay would have been uppermost in his mind, but if he doesn't know, that's fine. Thank you.
Further questions? Someone like to move the report be noted? Moved by Councillor Lord. Seconded Councillor Hall one last time. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor?
Happy to for the last time. Yep. Look, I think there's a few things. This report is for it's not quite the first quarter. Things that, to my thing, we're ahead of where our budget was. But I just want to take issue with something that Councillor Vandervis referred to in an earlier debate about the fact that our council's going into debt by $100 million a year. We made an exception in this year's annual plan, increased the debt loading to, I think it was just over 100 or about $100 million. But for the rest of the long-term plan, there's been no change at this stage, and so we've got 4 years in the plan where we're looking around between $39 and $45 million. We've got 1 year where we're going to increase our debt by $55 million. We've got 3 years where just at a rough guess it's around about $64 million. There's one at 65 and one at 60. I just averaged the 3 years. We've got 1 year at 75 million, and this year the expectation is $100 million. So I think what you need to do when you consider that debt, you also have to consider what you're getting for your money. And when we look at the CapEx spending of the last perhaps 3 years, it's been very, very close to $100 million a year average, or just on 100 million. And we've now built capacity within the city to continue to do large capital expenditure works. And perhaps one of the reasons, when I first came to council, we were spending $30–40 million, and we were in a post-stadium, very constrained environment, and perhaps some people would think we should be still in a constrained environment. But I think what we need to realise is that people around our city are saying, look, our roads are not good enough. People are saying we need to upgrade different things, and we see ourselves, we're spending money on this building, we're spending money on the library. There's you know, a lot of stuff happening around this city, and some of that share falls to us. So look, I'm not uncomfortable with this, and I think this is a good result for the first part of the year.
Thank you, Councillor. Further speakers? I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Item 15, proposed event and filmmaking road closures for October, November and December 2022. Mr. Drew. He at least got all the way to his seat beforehand. We haven't got. Are there questions? Councillor Gary, justifying your Fitbit metrics.
Got to give you a reason to sit up there, Mr. Drew. Just a very specific question, actually. Page 102. Is that an overseas film? Do you know? And does it? Those bigger films that seem to be coming from overseas, those are the ones that often require more in the way of closures and so forth. Would that be correct?
That's correct in the terms of closures, but I'm not too sure where it's coming from.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Raddick.
Just a curiosity question. Item 4, paragraph 4 on page 102. Current modelling. Graduation brings 1.35 to 1.8. Is that per annum or per event?
Again, it may not be a question for transport, but Mr. Christie is here.
I think that would be per event, Councillor.
Yeah. Thank you.
Moved by Councillor Vandervis and seconded by Councillor Elder. Thank you. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor? Are there speakers? No. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. I will now move, per the order paper, that we move into non-public and adjourn the meeting for however long it is required. 5 minutes? Adjourn the meeting for 5 minutes. Seconded Councillor Gary. All those in favour? Those against? That's agreed. Thanks.